It was the kind of winter night that made you question every reason you'd ever had to step outside, one of those late-season blizzards that seemed determined to wipe Boulder, Colorado, off the map for good. The wind howled like a warning, biting at exposed skin and hurling icy pellets against every window and windshield in town. Most folks were home, curtains drawn, cradling mugs of cocoa or bourbon, but Officer Tyler Brooks was not most folks. Tyler's shift had started before the storm rolled in, but now it was nearly midnight, and he was still patrolling the eerily deserted streets, headlights barely cutting through the swirling curtain of snow. Radio chatter was mostly static and weather warnings. His hands ached from the cold, even inside the heated cruiser. Still, he was restless. Something about nights like these made trouble crawl out from wherever it was hiding. He was rolling past the old train station, now abandoned and half buried under drifts, when his headlights swept across something that made him pump the brakes. For a split second, he thought it was just a trick of the snow. But no. There it was again. A dark shape, hunched near the loading dock, pressed up against the wind-battered wall. Too big for a cat, too still for a coyote. He pulled the cruiser over, engine idling, and stepped out into the teeth of the wind. His boots crunched across the ice as he approached, one hand on his flashlight, the other resting near his holster out of habit. The shape didn't move. Tyler's heart picked up. He'd seen plenty of strays in his time, raccoons, foxes, even a bear once, but there was something unnatural about how completely motionless this one was, as if the life had been leached right out of it. He crouched a few feet away, shining his light. The beam revealed a German shepherd, big, or at least it had been, before hunger and cold stripped the bulk from its frame. Its fur was matted and dusted with frost, patches of skin visible beneath the coat. The dog didn't growl, didn't snarl, didn't even flinch. Its eyes were wide but empty, staring past Tyler as if he were just another ghost in the storm. "Hey, buddy," Tyler said, keeping his voice low and steady. "You alone out here?" Nothing, not so much as a twitch. He eased forward, scanning for a collar, for any hint this was someone's missing pet and not another casualty of neglect. There was no tag, no sign of an owner, only a battered body and a pair of haunted, unblinking eyes. The wind picked up, sending a fresh flurry swirling around them. Tyler felt something in his chest tighten. He'd seen dogs in bad shape before, but this was different. There was no aggression, no fear, just an eerie stillness, like the dog had shut down every system but the one keeping it breathing. He shrugged off his jacket and gently draped it over the animal's back. Still nothing. He slid an arm underneath, surprised by how little resistance he met. The dog was ice cold and limp, barely more than a sack of bones and fur. Tyler cradled it carefully, murmuring soft encouragements he wasn't sure the dog could even hear. He carried the animal back to his cruiser, laying him across the back seat, and cranked up the heat. As he drove, Tyler kept glancing in the rearview mirror. He was used to the way dogs would whine or bark or tremble, but this one didn't move at all, not when the car rumbled over potholes, not when Tyler spoke, not even when the heater blasted hot air into the freezing space. The only sign of life was the faint rise and fall of its chest. The vet's clinic was on the far side of town, a squat brick building with a battered sign half covered in snow. The parking lot was empty, no surprise at this hour. But Tyler had Miriam Hayes' personal number for emergencies. He texted her, then carried the dog up to the door, leaving heavy boot prints in the snow behind him. Miriam opened up within minutes, hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, face shadowed by exhaustion. Tyler had known her for years. She'd always been quiet, but something about her had shifted in the past year. She barely spoke anymore, unless it was about medicine, her voice distant and mechanical. She didn't ask questions as Tyler carried the German shepherd inside, just nodded and led the way to an exam room. The fluorescent lights were harsh, but the room was warm. Tyler laid the dog gently on the steel table. Miriam washed her hands in silence, snapping on gloves with practiced precision. "How long's he been like this?" she finally asked, her tone flat. "Not sure," Tyler replied. "Found him behind the train station. Looks like he hasn't eaten in days. Barely breathing, didn't even blink when I picked him up. Miriam ran her hands lightly over the dog's body, checking for broken bones or open wounds. The dog didn't react. Not to touch, not to the cold stethoscope, not to the vet's soft commands. She frowned, eyes narrowing as she examined the mouth. Something metallic glinted just above the palate. She paused. "What's that?" Tyler asked, stepping closer. "I'm not sure," Miriam murmured. "It's embedded. Not a tag, not a staple. I've never seen anything like it." She prodded gently with a gloved finger, feeling for any give, but the object was fused tight against the bone. The dog didn't even gag or twitch. "His temperature's dangerously low," she said. "I need to get him warmed up and start fluids. Whatever this is, it can wait until he's stable." Tyler nodded, watching as Miriam worked quickly, setting up an IV, wrapping the dog in heated blankets, monitoring vitals with a steady calm that spoke of years spent on the edge of disaster. Still, even he could see the worry etched in her face. For the first time in months, something flickered in Miriam's eyes. Not quite hope, not yet, but curiosity. Maybe even concern. Tyler recognized it and felt a small surge of relief. As he watched her move around the room, he realized he'd been holding his breath. The storm still raged outside, battering the windows and painting the world in relentless white. But in this small, warm pocket of light, two people fought to save a life that the world had already forgotten. The dog still didn't move, but Tyler thought, maybe, just maybe, he saw a flicker of life behind those empty eyes. Or maybe it was just a trick of the light, a hope born out of a long, cold night and the desperate need for something good to survive the storm. Dr. Miriam Hayes moved through her clinic on autopilot, every movement clinical, every thought muted behind a curtain of exhaustion. Outside, the blizzard pounded the windows, but inside it was all fluorescent light, the hum of medical equipment and the faint sound of a heater struggling against the chill. She barely felt the cold anymore, not after everything that had happened. It had been almost 9 months since her fiancé, Andrew, died in a climbing accident outside Estes Park. In that time, she'd stopped counting the days, stopped answering friends' messages, stopped doing anything but working and sleeping. She went through the motions with her patients, treating every animal with practiced care. But it felt like watching someone else's hands move. Her world had narrowed to the clinic's 4 walls and the white static in her mind. But something about the German Shepherd pulled her in. The way the dog's body didn't react, didn't tremble or resist, unsettled her more than any injury she'd ever seen. She found herself glancing at him every few minutes as she set up fluids and heat packs, watching for even the smallest sign of life. He was like a shadow of an animal, a breathing statue, and then there was that strange metallic glint in the roof of his mouth. It stuck in her mind, pulling her back even as she tried to retreat into numbness. The clinic was quiet. Her last nurse had left early, worried about the roads. Miriam stayed because she had nowhere else to be, nowhere she wanted to go. She moved the shepherd into the isolation room, checking the temperature again, still dangerously low, but climbing. She wrote down the numbers, her handwriting precise but detached, the way she'd always done, even in the worst emergencies. As she worked, her mind drifted. She remembered the first time she and Andrew brought home a rescue, a battered old beagle with a lopsided grin and more heart than sense. The memory came unbidden, sharp and painful, and she pushed it away. She didn't have time for that. Not tonight. Returning to the shepherd, Miriam opened his jaws again. The light caught the metal, a small, seamless disc pressed flat against the palate. It wasn't a bullet or shrapnel. She touched it gently. It didn't move. No swelling, no sign of infection, just an alien thing in the mouth of a dying dog. She hesitated, gloved hands trembling just a little, her breath misting in the cold air. For the first time in months, she felt something other than emptiness. A flicker of curiosity, a spark of worry, even fear. She turned away quickly, covering the dog in another blanket, telling herself to focus. A knock startled her. She looked up to see Tyler, hovering in the hallway with a cup of vending machine coffee. "You okay?" he asked, voice softer than usual. "I'm fine," she replied automatically, not meeting his eyes. He lingered for a moment, then set the cup on the counter. I can stick around if you need anything. I'm used to being alone, she said, maybe a little too sharply. He nodded, retreating without another word. Miriam sat on the stool beside the shepherd, her hands curled into fists. She watched the slow, shallow rise and fall of his chest, the way his eyes stared at nothing. She wondered what had happened to him. Who would abandon an animal in a blizzard, leave it to die behind a train station? She whispered, almost without realizing it, "Who did this to you?" There was no answer, of course. The dog remained still, lost somewhere she couldn't follow. Sighing, she pulled out her phone and snapped a picture of the metal object. She hesitated, then typed out a message to an old college friend, Dr. Lena Ford, now working at CU Boulder as a neuroengineer. The two hadn't spoken much since Andrew died. Still, Miriam knew if anyone might recognize this kind of tech, it would be Lena. "Hey, it's Miriam. Sorry for the late message. Found a strange implant in a German shepherd. Metal disc, palate. Any ideas?" She attached the photo and hit send before she could second-guess herself. The response came faster than she expected. "That doesn't look like any veterinary device I've seen. Can you get an x-ray?" Miriam's hands shook a little as she rolled the dog to the imaging room, careful not to jostle his limp body. The machine whirred and beeped, spitting out digital images. She uploaded them and sent them off to Lena. "Not veterinary," Lena replied after a pause. "Looks almost like some neuro prototype I saw in a DARPA paper." "You sure this dog wasn't military?" Miriam frowned. "Military," she muttered to herself, glancing at the shepherd's starved, battered frame. It was possible. Boulder wasn't far from a dozen old bases and experimental labs, and she'd treated working dogs before, but never anything like this. She returned to the exam room, mind racing. The dog still hadn't moved, not even his eyes. She tried food, a soft word, even a gentle touch on his paw. No reaction. He was completely shut down, the way some animals get after extreme trauma, as if the world had simply become too much. The minutes crawled by. Miriam sat by the shepherd's side, watching for any sign he was coming back. Instead, she felt the cold fingers of grief curling around her heart again, reminding her of all the things she'd lost. She wanted to give up, to let the numbness take over again. But she couldn't look away from those empty eyes. Suddenly, the door opened, letting in a gust of cold air and the sound of laughter. Cassie and her grandmother, Mrs. Rowland, entered, bundled in layers, faces red from the wind. "I'm sorry, Dr. Hayes," Mrs. Rowland said. Cassie insisted on coming to check on Peanut, but... "Oh, what happened to that dog?" Miriam forced a smile. "Just a stray. Not doing so well." Cassie was a shy 10-year-old, all big brown eyes and nervous energy. She hovered by the door, clinging to her grandmother's coat. "Can I see him?" Cassie asked softly. Miriam hesitated, but nodded. "He's very sick. He might not wake up." Cassie tiptoed over, peering at the shepherd. She didn't flinch at the sight of the battered animal. Instead, she knelt beside the table and whispered, "You look like a ranger, like the ones in the stories my dad tells." Miriam watched in surprise as Cassie gently stroked the dog's ear. The shepherd didn't move, but for the first time, something in the room felt different. A flicker of warmth, a fragile hope. Miriam's phone buzzed again. "Don't do anything until I look into this. Seriously, call me if anything changes," Lena texted. Mrs. Rowland guided Cassie back to the waiting area, but Cassie kept glancing back over her shoulder, worry etched across her face. Miriam watched her go, then turned back to the shepherd. She found herself whispering, "Ranger, huh? Let's see if you live up to the name." The storm continued to howl outside, but inside, for the first time in a long while, Miriam felt a sliver of purpose slice through the fog. She sat beside the dog until the sky outside began to pale, hoping against hope that something would bring him back. The gray of dawn crept slowly across Boulder, casting the town in a blue hush as the worst of the storm finally broke. In the clinic, Dr. Miriam Hayes stood in the pale light of the X-ray room, a mug of cold coffee in her hand, staring at the digital images on her laptop. The German shepherd, Cassie's ranger, lay still as stone in the exam room next door, bundled in blankets, an IV taped to his front leg. His eyes still didn't track movement, but his chest rose and fell, steady but shallow, and the metallic object in his mouth glimmered in the radiograph like a coin pressed into stone. Miriam took a deep breath and picked up her phone, heart tapping a nervous rhythm. She dialed Lena Ford, her old college friend. The two hadn't spoken face-to-face in nearly a year. Grief and the pressures of their respective careers kept getting in the way. But this was different. Miriam needed answers. Lena answered on the second ring, her voice scratchy and urgent. "Hey, Miri, I saw the x-rays. You weren't kidding. That's no veterinary implant. Looks seamless, almost like a prototype I saw back at Caltech." "What's his story?" Miriam recounted what she knew. The blizzard, the abandoned train station, the catatonic state. He won't eat, won't respond to sound or touch. No aggression, just nothing. The only unusual thing, aside from how bad he looks, is that implant. "Can you send me a high-res scan?" Lena asked, suddenly brisk in all business. "And can you try to see if it's magnetic? If it is, it might be something they used for neurointerfacing, old research, black budget stuff." Miriam nodded and did as instructed. The object was cool to the touch, oddly heavy, and not magnetic. Not with a fridge magnet, anyway. She updated Lena, who whistled quietly. "I'm going to dig around," Lena said. "I think it's related to some stuff I saw on Operation Threshold, classified DARPA project, meant to override animal instinct, basically make the perfect working dog. But it was shelved years ago. They said all test animals were destroyed. If this dog is from that program, that's a problem." Miriam's skin prickled. "You mean he's military?" "Or was. But if he's still alive and he's got a chip like that, you need to be careful. Don't let anyone know you have him until we figure this out, okay?" Miriam agreed, tension curling in her gut. She ended the call and looked through the glass at Ranger. He seemed smaller somehow, dwarfed by the table, his fur dull and patchy. She felt a pang of something close to pity, or maybe guilt, for feeling connected to a lost cause when she'd spent so long shutting herself off from feeling anything at all. A soft knock startled her. She turned to see Cassie peeking through the exam room door, her small hands clasped in front of her. Can I talk to him again?" the girl asked, voice barely above a whisper. Miriam hesitated, but nodded. "Just for a minute." Cassie walked up to the table and gently rested her head beside the shepherd's. "You can hear me, can't you?" she whispered. "My dad says rangers always find their way home, no matter what, even when people think they're gone forever." Miriam watched, heart aching in a way she hadn't expected. She didn't believe in magic or miracles, but something about Cassie's hope felt infectious, just for a moment. She glanced at the monitor. No change in heart rate, but maybe there was something different in the way Ranger's ears twitched. Or maybe that was just wishful thinking. By mid-morning, the clinic's waiting room began to fill with clients, pets needing vaccines, checkups, and medicine for ailments that felt trivial compared to the mystery sleeping on her exam table. Miriam did her best to focus, checking on Ranger between appointments. He remained unresponsive, but each time she looked in on him, she felt a growing sense of urgency, a compulsion to solve the riddle before her. After her last patient, Lena called back, her voice low and urgent. "Miri, listen. Threshold wasn't just about obedience. There were rumors they were experimenting with behavior suppression, turning dogs into living surveillance. Even assassins. Some of the tech I'm seeing in your photos matches those rumors." That device in his mouth? It's more than just a tracker or ID. It might be actively shutting down his natural responses. Miriam's heart hammered. "How do I get it out?" "Carefully," Lena said. "If it's fused to the bone, you'll need to sedate him, make an incision along the palate, and try not to damage any nerves. Get it out whole if you can, and record everything. If someone's still interested in these dogs, they'll want that chip back." "Should I call the police?" Lena hesitated. "Not yet. Trust no one outside your circle until you know what you're dealing with. I'll drive up tonight if the road's clear. Be safe, okay?" Miriam hung up, nerves jangling. She prepared her tools for surgery, local anesthetic, scalpels, forceps. She hesitated before starting, looking again at Ranger's empty eyes. For a moment, 1,000 memories of Andrew's steady hands and gentle words flashed through her mind. "You always do the right thing, Mary, even when it's hard." She placed a reassuring hand on Ranger's head. "Let's see what secrets you're carrying, big guy." As she sat up, Cassie lingered just outside the door, her nose pressed to the glass. "Will he wake up?" she asked. Miriam forced a smile. "I hope so. He just needs a little help." She scrubbed in, gloved up, and gently sedated Ranger. The dog's breathing slowed. Miriam's hands worked methodically, guided by years of experience and a new, shaking fear. The incision was tiny, but blood welled quickly. She found the edge of the implant, smooth, cold, alien. It was fused to the bone, but not impossible to remove. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she worked, her eyes darting to the monitors for any sign of distress. Step by step, she teased the device free. It hummed faintly, almost like a wasp's wings, sending vibrations up her fingers. The sound made her stomach twist. At last the chip came free with a faint electronic whine. Miriam dropped it into a sterile dish, her breath ragged. The hum faded, leaving only silence. She stitched the wound, heart pounding. The room felt impossibly still. Ranger didn't move. Not yet. But in that tense, suspended moment, Miriam felt the weight of something shifting, the sense that they'd just opened a door, and whatever was on the other side would change everything. The first step was done. The real mystery, and the danger, was only just beginning. The storm finally relented by late afternoon, leaving Boulder wrapped in a thick, muffled silence. Snowdrifts pressed against the clinic windows. Inside, Dr. Miriam Hayes hovered over the recovery table, the extracted chip sealed in a sterile jar on her desk. She kept glancing between it and the German Shepherd, whose chest now rose and fell with the slow rhythm of sedation. The device's faint hum was gone, but in its place, the air seemed charged with anticipation, as if the whole world was waiting for something to happen. Miriam cleaned up from surgery with hands that trembled more from adrenaline than cold. She forced herself to move methodically, sterilizing instruments, updating notes, checking vital signs. Yet her mind kept looping back to what Lena said. That chip was never meant for a family pet. Its presence meant Ranger, as Cassie had named him, was a ghost from a world of secrets and shadows. As the sedative wore off, Miriam positioned herself at the shepherd's side, her breath fogging in the chilly room. The dog's eyelids fluttered. For a long time nothing else happened. Then, so slowly it almost went unnoticed, his head turned, just a few degrees, but enough to suggest awareness. His ears twitched. The eyes, previously hollow and distant, blinked once, twice, as if fighting through thick fog. Miriam leaned in, her voice gentle but urgent. "Ranger? Can you hear me?" For a long, suspended moment, there was nothing. Then, a slow, uncertain movement. His nose twitched. The corners of his mouth quivered, and his gaze tracked toward her. He didn't flinch from the light. Instead, he blinked again, as if testing the world, waking from a dream he never chose. Miriam's heart hammered with hope and disbelief. She reached out, hesitating only for a second, and let her hand rest on his paw. His tongue flicked out, a hesitant, almost childlike gesture, and licked her wrist. A soft, breathy sound, half sigh, half whimper, escaped his throat. It was the first sign of life, of connection, since he'd arrived. She exhaled, not realizing she'd been holding her breath. "Hey, Ranger. You're okay. You're safe." Cassie, who had been sitting cross-legged in the hallway with her grandmother, darted into the room at the first sign of movement. She stopped at the edge of the table, eyes wide with a mixture of awe and relief. "Is he awake?" Cassie asked. Miriam nodded, her smile breaking through the hard shell she'd worn for so long. "He's awake. Come say hi, gently." Cassie crept forward and extended a trembling hand. "Hey, Ranger," she whispered, her words so soft they barely made it past her lips. "Remember me?" Ranger's eyes found Cassie. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, he shifted, his gaze following her, ears pricking forward. It wasn't the quick, tail-wagging response of a happy dog, but it was deliberate, conscious. Cassie grinned, her whole face lighting up. "He does remember," she squealed, and for the first time in months, Miriam heard the sound of genuine joy fill her clinic. Mrs. Rowland, Cassie's grandmother, stepped inside, wiping her eyes. "That's a miracle, Dr. Hayes, truly." But Miriam only half heard her. She was studying Ranger, looking for any sign of distress. Instead, the dog's heartbeat steadied, his breathing deepened, and a subtle energy began to replace the blankness in his gaze. She scribbled notes, responsive to voice, tracks movement, initiated contact. The rest of the afternoon unfolded with cautious optimism. Miriam tried offering Ranger a small bowl of wet food. At first, he stared at it, unsure. But then, slowly, almost mechanically, he sniffed and took a tentative bite. The taste must have registered because his movements became quicker, more natural, and within a few minutes, he had cleaned the bowl, licking it until it rattled on the table. Tyler, still on duty but unable to stay away, stopped by after hearing the news from Cassie's grandmother. He peeked into the recovery room and grinned. "He looks a whole lot better than when I found him." "He's still got a long road ahead," Miriam replied, "but it's a start." They watched as Cassie sat quietly beside Ranger, humming a tune under her breath. The German shepherd's eyes followed her every movement, occasionally letting out a soft, breathy woof. Not quite a bark, but a sound full of promise. Miriam found herself thinking of Andrew, not the tragedy, but the hope he used to bring into every dark situation. She blinked back tears, focusing on the here and now. As dusk settled over Boulder, the small clinic glowed with warmth, laughter, and cautious hope. Miriam checked on Ranger one last time, noting that his vitals were finally within normal range. She changed his bandages and gently stroked his head. "You've been through hell," she whispered, "but you're here. You made it." Before she left for the night, Miriam made one more decision. Cassie's words, "He looks like a ranger," echoed in her mind. There was something about the name that felt right. A badge of honor for a dog who had survived so much. She reached for the paperwork, and in the official log, wrote his name, Ranger. Later, as she sat in her small office, the snow reflecting golden light outside, Miriam sent a text to Lena. "The chip is out. He's responsive, eating, following us with his eyes. Even gave me a woof." Lena's reply was instant. "Incredible. Keep him close. I'm coming up tomorrow. And be careful, Miri. If this is what I think, someone might come looking for that chip. Or for him." Miriam felt the old fear return, but pushed it aside. Tonight, she allowed herself a rare moment of peace. She looked through the window into the recovery room, where Ranger was curled up on his blanket, Cassie resting her head beside him, their breathing matching in the quiet. The storm had passed, at least for now. Outside, Boulder glistened under the fresh snow, every rooftop and tree branch sparkling with new hope. Inside the clinic, a broken dog was waking up to a new life, watched over by a girl who believed in second chances, and a vet who, for the first time in months, felt her heart begin to thaw. Boulder seemed almost peaceful in the days that followed, the fresh snow outside the clinic reflecting sunlight so brightly it hurt the eyes. The world, at least on the surface, felt cleaner, softer, an illusion of calm that belied the brewing storm no one could see. For Dr. Miriam Hayes, these days were a series of small miracles. Every morning, she awoke, not to the numbing weight of grief, but to a strange, nervous anticipation. What would Ranger do next? Ranger's recovery was remarkable. He walked with a slight limp from muscle atrophy, but his movements grew more confident by the hour. He started wagging his tail, a cautious, uncertain wag at first, but stronger each time Cassie came to visit. Miriam watched as the bond between dog and child flourished. Cassie brought him toys and blankets, sang him silly songs, and read aloud from her favorite adventure books. Ranger would listen, sometimes laying his big head on her knee, his eyes tracking every word and movement. Tyler checked in every evening, sometimes bringing groceries or coffee, other times just quietly observing the dog he'd rescued from the snow. "You know," he said one night as Ranger dozed by Miriam's feet, "there's something about him, like he's still waiting for the other shoe to drop." Miriam nodded. She'd felt it too, the sense that Ranger's calm was the eye of a larger storm. She devoted her spare moments to research, poring over veterinary journals, military databases, and every bit of information Lena sent her way. Lena's calls grew more urgent as she dug deeper into the chip's origins. Miri, this wasn't just any military program. Operation Threshold was top secret, black budget, off-the-books stuff. They were trying to override canine instinct, program obedience into working dogs at the neural level. These dogs were never meant for public adoption or even traditional service work. They were for war zones, surveillance, infiltration, and, in the worst rumors, assassination. Miriam felt a chill as Lena continued. The program was scrapped after several incidents. The dogs proved unstable. The records say they were all destroyed, but Ranger obviously slipped through the cracks. That chip in his palate, it wasn't just a control device, Miri. It was also a beacon. It sent out a signal the moment it was removed. If the wrong people are watching, they might come looking. Miriam stared at Ranger, who was now sniffing curiously at a tennis ball Cassie had left behind. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on her shoulders. She'd saved this dog from death, but in doing so, she might have painted a target on both their backs. She began to notice odd things outside the clinic, an unfamiliar black SUV idling across the street for hours, a man in sunglasses snapping photos with a long lens. Once, while locking up, she saw the same SUV crawl past, headlights off, tires crunching quietly over the snow. Miriam's instincts, dulled for months by grief, now blazed with urgency. Inside, she pretended everything was normal. She tried to focus on her patients, treating a cat with frostbitten ears, stitching up a Labrador's paw, giving advice to a frazzled new puppy owner. But her mind was always half on Ranger and half on the growing sense of being watched. She made sure the chip was locked in her safe each night, hidden beneath folders and paperwork. One afternoon, Tyler brought in a bag of groceries and caught her peering through the blinds. "You okay?" Miriam hesitated, then told him about the SUV, the photos, the way her skin prickled with every unexplained noise. Tyler's face darkened. "Let me do a drive-by tonight, see if I can get a plate. And Miri, be careful, you and Cassie too." That evening, Lena arrived from Boulder. She and Miriam examined the chip under a microscope, marveled at the seamless design, and speculated on its function. "It's almost like it was designed to erase the dog's personality," Lena mused, her voice hushed. "Turn them into a blank slate, ready for commands." Miriam shuddered. "But he came back. He fought it." Lena nodded. "He's lucky. Most animals wouldn't. You did the right thing, Miri." But the right thing was starting to feel dangerous. Late that night, after Lena left for her hotel and Tyler finished his rounds, Miriam sat at her desk, reading a file Lena had pulled from an obscure military archive. It was full of redactions, but enough remained to piece together a chilling truth. Ranger wasn't just an accident. He was evidence. Living, breathing proof that Operation Threshold had crossed ethical lines that should never have been breached. Outside, the wind howled again. Miriam locked the doors, double-checked the windows, and placed Ranger's bed close to her own cot in the back room. She fell asleep with her hand resting on his head, comforted by the slow, steady sound of his breathing. She woke to a crash. For a heartbeat, Miriam thought she was dreaming, the sharp clang of metal, the creak of a door. Then she was fully awake, scrambling out of bed, her heart pounding. Ranger was already on his feet, head low, ears pinned back. He didn't bark. He moved like a soldier, alert and focused. Miriam grabbed her phone and a heavy flashlight, tiptoeing toward the front of the clinic. The main exam room was in disarray. Papers scattered, drawers open, the microscope knocked over. Her first panicked thought was for Ranger, then the chip. She raced to the safe, hands shaking. It was empty. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken glass, no splintered locks. On the stainless steel table was a single, typed note, neat and chilling in its simplicity. "Return what belongs." Miriam's blood ran cold. Someone had been inside, had walked through her clinic while she and Ranger slept. She checked on Cassie, who was spending the night in the small guest room with her grandmother. Both were still asleep, unharmed. She called Tyler, voice trembling. He arrived within minutes, his cruiser's lights flashing silently outside. No sign of entry, he confirmed. Whoever did this was professional. This isn't over, Miri. You need to get somewhere safe. Miriam's mind raced. She packed a bag with essentials, medical supplies, food, her laptop, and Ranger's leash. She woke Cassie and Mrs. Rowland, explained what happened in a low, urgent voice, and told them to get dressed. There was only one place she trusted now, her late grandmother's cabin, tucked away in the mountains near Nederland, off-grid and nearly impossible to find in the snow. As dawn broke over Boulder, Miriam loaded Ranger, Cassie, and Mrs. Rowland into her old Subaru. She looked back at the clinic, a place of healing that now felt like a battlefield, then at Ranger, who sat in the back seat, eyes sharp and alert. "We're not running," she whispered, as much to herself as to him. "We're surviving." As they drove north, the city receded in the rearview mirror, replaced by winding roads and endless trees. Whatever ghosts were following them, they would have to brave the mountains to finish what they started. And this time, Miriam was determined not to lose anyone she loved again. The sun was just beginning to rise as Miriam steered her Subaru out of Boulder, the sky a pale watercolor of pink and gold over the snow-draped pines. Cassie huddled quietly in the back seat, her grandmother's arms wrapped tightly around her. Ranger sat upright beside them, alert, his gaze fixed on the winding road ahead. Miriam gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles whitened, the tension in her body never letting go. Every mile that put Boulder farther behind felt like a tiny relief, and a fresh wave of guilt. She hadn't planned on running. For most of her adult life, Miriam had prided herself on meeting trouble head-on, on never backing down. But last night's break-in shattered that confidence. Someone had moved through her clinic with silent, professional precision, taken only the chip, left no trace but a message that made her blood run cold. Return what belongs. And she knew, with a sick certainty, that whoever wanted the chip might soon want Ranger himself. She had no intention of giving either up. The drive to Nederland was slow, the mountain roads still slick with ice from the blizzard. The cabin, nestled deep in a stand of blue spruce and lodgepole pine, had belonged to Miriam's grandmother, a place of childhood summers, wildflowers, and quiet afternoons spent listening to wind in the trees. It had been years since anyone stayed there in winter. Off-grid, heated only by a wood stove and an ancient propane heater, it was as close to invisible as you could get. Miriam had no doubt it was their best chance at staying safe, at least for a while. They arrived just after sunrise, the tires crunching on fresh snow. Miriam hurried everyone inside. The cabin was cold and dark, but the bones of it were solid. Thick walls, heavy curtains, a little generator for the bare essentials. Miriam worked quickly, building a fire, checking the locks, unrolling sleeping bags. Cassie and her grandmother helped as best they could, following her lead with quiet trust. Ranger explored the cabin with slow, methodical steps, sniffing every corner, tail held stiff with uncertainty. Miriam watched him, struck by how different he was from the catatonic animal she'd first met. He didn't whine or bark, just moved with the wary caution of a survivor, every muscle alert. She wondered what memories lay behind those watchful eyes, what he'd seen, what he'd endured, what orders had been carved into his mind by that terrible chip. After breakfast, instant oatmeal and tea heated on the wood stove, Miriam set up a makeshift exam space in the living room. She checked Ranger's stitches, cleaned his wound, and updated her notes. He tolerated it all, in silence, even letting Cassie hold his paw. If he remembered the trauma of his surgery, it didn't show. For the first time in days, the outside world felt very far away. The snow muffled every sound. The only noise inside was the crackle of the fire and the low hum of the generator. Cassie and her grandmother curled up on the couch, reading. Miriam sat at the window, watching for headlights that never came. But the peace was uneasy. Miriam's phone had no signal, and the old landline was dead. Either a casualty of the storm or something more sinister. She charged her laptop using the generator, typing up every detail of Ranger's rescue, the chip, the break-in, and the menacing note. She attached the photos, x-rays, and Lena's research, then saved everything to a thumb drive. If anything happened to her, She wanted the truth to survive. Cassie, for her part, did her best to keep Ranger occupied. She taught him how to fetch a squeaky toy she'd packed, coaxed him into playing gentle tug-of-war, and rewarded every tail wag with a delighted giggle. Miriam watched as the haunted look slowly faded from Ranger's eyes, replaced by something like curiosity. Cassie's grandmother, Mrs. Rowland, baked biscuits in a cast-iron pan and insisted everyone eat, no matter how tight their nerves. That afternoon, Tyler arrived. He'd followed their tire tracks up the mountain in his battered pickup, having guessed where Miriam would go. He brought groceries and news. The clinic was being watched. That black SUV's still circling. I recognized one of the guys. Military cut, sunglasses, the works. They want something, and they're not going away. Miriam felt a knot of fear twist tighter. Did you see anyone you knew? Tyler shook his head. Not from around here, but they knew what they were doing. No prints, no fibers, no security cam footage. I asked the neighbors to keep an eye out, but honestly, you're safer up here. At least for now. He knelt beside Ranger, who sniffed his hand, then, after a long pause, licked his palm. Tyler grinned. He's a good dog. Glad you saved him. That night, as snow began to fall again, Miriam sat by the fire and talked for the first time about Andrew, her lost fiancé. Cassie listened quietly, eyes wide. Mrs. Rowland squeezed Miriam's hand. He would have been proud of you, she said. Miriam tried to believe it. The truth was, she hadn't felt proud in a long time. Hadn't felt much of anything but grief and guilt. But here, with Cassie and her grandmother, Tyler, and Ranger, she felt something shift. The cabin, for all its chill and isolation, became a place of slow healing. They laughed over burnt biscuits, told ghost stories by lantern light, and watched Ranger learn to trust, little by little. Evenings were hardest. The fear never fully left Miriam's chest, the certainty that the men in the SUV were still searching, that their quiet exile might only be temporary. She kept a heavy flashlight by her bed and slept with Ranger at her feet. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, she'd wake to hear him pacing the cabin as if standing watch over them all. On the third day, she finished typing up her account and, with Tyler's help, hiked a mile through the woods to the nearest mailbox. She mailed the thumb drive, labeled only with the initials RK, to Riley Kane, a local journalist known for exposing government secrets and covering the stories others feared to touch. Miriam didn't know if the information would ever make it into the light, but it was a small act of defiance, a way to make sure Ranger's story would not be erased, no matter how powerful his pursuers. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the cabin in deeper silence. But inside, life pressed forward. Ranger began to play, Cassie laughed more, and Miriam found herself dreaming again, not just of the past, but of a future that might be possible if they could survive the ghosts still hunting them. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, Miriam felt the world slowing down. The blizzard was gone, replaced by gentle, steady snowfall, the mountains wrapped in a quiet that seeped through the cabin walls. Nederland was a different world from Boulder, especially in winter. A place where time stretched and folded, where every sound was softened by drifts of white and the hush of tall pines. It was the sort of place where healing, if it ever happened, might actually have a chance to take root. At first, everyone remained on edge. Miriam barely slept, always listening for the crunch of tires or the knock of a stranger. Cassie woke from uneasy dreams, sometimes wandering into the living room to find Ranger already awake, pacing between the doors, nose pressed to the cold window panes. But as days passed without incident, a fragile sense of safety began to return. The old cabin, with its stone fireplace and handmade quilts, felt like a fortress carved out of time. Ranger changed before their eyes. It started small, a cautious wag of the tail, a head tilt when Cassie called his name, the flicker of intelligence in his eyes that seemed almost human. He learned the pattern of the cabin quickly, waiting by the wood stove for scraps, dozing beside Cassie as she read, nudging his nose into Mrs. Rowland's palm for a biscuit. He was still nervous with sudden noises, flinching at the snap of firewood or the drone of the old generator, but every day, his confidence grew. On the third morning, he brought Cassie a soggy tennis ball, dropping it at her feet and giving her a look that could only mean, "Let's play." Cassie's laughter filled the cabin, bright and infectious. She invented new games, hide-and-seek with Ranger's favorite squeaky toy, races through the hallway, made up obstacle courses with pillows and boots. Ranger played along, sometimes clumsy, but always gentle, as if he knew Cassie's size and energy and matched himself to her pace. Once, he even barked, a hoarse, unused sound that startled everyone and sent Cassie into a fit of giggles. For Miriam, watching this transformation was like thawing after a long, bitter winter. She joined in, teaching Cassie how to care for Ranger's wound, showing her how to change his bandages, clean his ears, and brush his coat. These lessons were more than just practical. They were a bridge back to the woman Miriam had been before grief hollowed her out. In the quiet of the mountain mornings, as sunlight poured through the frosted windows, she found herself telling stories again. About her childhood in this very cabin. About the wild foxes she used to watch from the porch. About Andrew and his endless optimism. One afternoon, as Cassie napped and Mrs. Rowland baked bread, Miriam and Tyler walked the snowy trails around the cabin. Tyler had become a near-constant presence, a steady, quiet friend who brought supplies and news from Boulder, keeping watch for any sign of danger. The two moved in comfortable silence, the only sounds the crunch of their boots and the distant calls of chickadees. Miriam felt the urge to share something, to confess the way the fear and guilt had nearly broken her, but the words caught in her throat. Tyler paused, looking out over the valley below. "You did the right thing, you know, getting Ranger out, protecting Cassie and her grandma. You could have run the other way." Miriam hugged herself against the chill. "Sometimes I wish I had. I never wanted this, any of it. But I couldn't leave him behind. Not when I knew what he was." "Yeah, well," Tyler replied. "Sometimes being brave means not running, even when every part of you wants to." She looked at him and managed a faint smile. "Maybe you're right." Back at the cabin, Cassie's sense of wonder was contagious. She asked endless questions about Ranger. Could he remember his old life? Did he know tricks? Would he always be her friend? Miriam answered as best she could, but the truth was, she didn't know. Ranger's past was a tangle of shadows, experiments, orders, pain, but each day he seemed to move farther from that darkness, drawn toward the warmth and chaos of Cassie's affection. Mrs. Rowland, who'd always been reserved, started to open up as well. She told stories of her own childhood, of the Great Depression, of surviving hard winters, and learning to trust the slow, steady return of spring. She took comfort in the simple routines of mountain life, kneading bread, mending clothes, stoking the fire. It was a rhythm Miriam hadn't realized she'd missed, a reminder that life could be rebuilt one small act at a time. In the evenings, the four of them would gather around the fire. Tyler read aloud from dog-eared mysteries. Mrs. Rowland sipped her tea. Cassie snuggled into Miriam's side with Ranger sprawled across both their feet. They listened to the wind rattle the shutters and the snow pile up against the windows. And for a little while, the world outside, the menacing SUV, the break-in, the unsolved questions, faded into the background. Miriam started to dream again, for the first time since Andrew's death. Sometimes she dreamed of the accident, the sound of stone giving way, the frantic search that ended in heartbreak. But more often, she dreamed of the future, of laughter and warmth, of Cassie growing up strong and unafraid, of Ranger running through green fields in spring. She awoke with tears in her eyes, but they were tears of hope, not just pain. Each day, Miriam wrote down everything she could remember about the chip, the break-in, the strange men in Boulder, the signals Lena had found. She documented Ranger's progress, the way he learned, healed, played. She sent it all, encrypted, to Riley Kane, the local journalist, using whatever Wi-Fi signal Tyler could rig up from his truck's satellite hotspot. It was a small act of defiance, but it made her feel less helpless, like she was fighting back, one story at a time. One morning, a package arrived at the mailbox, left anonymously. Inside was a disposable phone and a note. "Keep talking. The world needs to know." Riley's work had begun. The story of Ranger and Operation Threshold was growing legs. Rumors were spreading, and the government was scrambling to contain them. The fear never vanished completely. At night, Miriam would watch the tree line, waiting for headlights that never appeared. But the mountains offered a kind of peace the city never could, a place where ghosts faded and new memories took root. Cassie learned to snowshoe. Mrs. Rowland taught her to bake bread. Ranger learned to chase sticks through drifts taller than he was, returning each time with a proud prance. They were isolated, yes, but they weren't alone. They were becoming something stronger, a family forged in crisis, bound by survival and hope. For the first time since that terrible night in Boulder, Miriam let herself believe that healing, slow, messy, imperfect, was truly possible. Ranger was living proof. If he could come back from the darkness, maybe she could too. The morning the story broke, Nederland awoke beneath a sky so clear it felt like a promise. The silence around the cabin was interrupted only by the distant rumble of Tyler's pickup, the crunch of Ranger's paws in fresh snow, and Cassie's laughter as she chased him across the yard. Inside, Miriam was finishing her notes for Riley Kane, carefully organizing each file, every photo, and scanned X-ray, as if assembling evidence for a trial no one had yet called. She barely heard her phone buzz until Cassie came running in, breathless, waving her own battered tablet. "Dr. Hayes, look, Ranger's on the news." Miriam snatched up her phone. There it was, her inbox filling with alerts, texts from friends she hadn't spoken to in months, subject lines all the same. Riley Kane, expose, Project Threshold, and the dog who survived. The article was front-page digital news, picked up by outlets across the country. Riley had done what he did best, turned their scrambled files and blurry photos into a compelling, undeniable story. The expose was more than just a local interest piece. It was a shot across the bow at the powers that be, naming names and pulling no punches. An anonymous veterinarian in Colorado, known only as Dr. H, has provided evidence of a secret military program designed to turn dogs into living surveillance machines, and more. Leaked documents and medical scans confirm the existence of a neural implant removed from a German shepherd, now named Ranger, who survived both the program in an apparent attempt to erase him from the public eye. Riley included everything: the X-rays, the chip's design sketches, even photos of Ranger with Cassie and Tyler, their faces blurred. His language was measured but relentless, making it clear that this was a matter of national importance. The story caught fire within hours. By noon, cable news vans were crawling through Boulder, helicopters circled the mountains, and Miriam's phone wouldn't stop ringing. At first, it felt like hope. People were talking, government spokespeople rushed out statements denying involvement. "There is no such program," one official claimed. "These allegations are false and irresponsible." But the denials only fueled the frenzy. On social media, hashtags like #RangerSurvived, #FreePaws, and #ThresholdTruth began trending. Former military contractors and whistleblowers started reaching out to Riley, and through him, to Miriam. A retired handler described dogs that changed overnight, like someone flipped a switch. Another claimed her own K9 vanished after an unannounced transfer, just disappeared, never to be seen again. Ranger became more than a survivor. He was a symbol, a living challenge to anyone who tried to bury the truth. For Miriam, the sudden spotlight was terrifying. She'd spent nearly a year hiding from the world, letting her life shrink to the four walls of her clinic. Now, the world was pounding on the door, demanding answers she wasn't sure she had. She could barely keep up with the emails, requests for interviews, TV appearances, even book agents eager to tell Ranger's story. But there was no time to rest. The phone calls grew more ominous. Blocked numbers, strange pauses, voices that asked for details she'd never released. Tyler confirmed that unmarked cars were still circling the clinic in Boulder. Lena called with a warning. If they can't get Ranger back quietly, they might try something more public. Be ready for anything. Cassie picked up on the tension. She stopped laughing, started watching the tree line as she played. At night, she asked, "Are we safe, Dr. Hayes? What if the bad men come back?" Miriam knelt beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're safe for now. And we're not alone anymore. The whole country is watching, Cassie. People care about what happens to Ranger. And to us. Still, she couldn't sleep. She started locking every window twice, kept the satellite phone Tyler brought her charged and within arm's reach, and insisted that Ranger sleep at her feet. Mrs. Rowland doubled down on her baking, filling the cabin with the smells of bread and cinnamon, as if warmth could keep fear at bay. One afternoon, as the sun blazed through the cabin windows, Tyler arrived with a stack of letters, handwritten notes from children and adults across the country. For Ranger, the envelopes read. One, scrawled in crayon, said, "You're my hero. I want to help all dogs be free." Another was a drawing. Ranger standing tall, with Cassie and Miriam beside him, big hearts drawn overhead. For Cassie, the letters were a balm. She read each one aloud to Ranger, who cocked his head as if listening. "See, people believe in you, just like I do," she whispered. But not everyone was supportive. The story had polarized the nation. Some accused Miriam and her friends of making it all up, of seeking fame. Others claimed Ranger was dangerous and should be returned for government study. The hate mail came too. Veiled threats, slurs, warnings to "shut up before someone gets hurt." Riley Kane called, his voice strained. "You're in the center of a storm, Doc. But you're also changing things. People are coming forward. I've got a senator on the line who wants you to testify. Don't let them scare you into silence." The news spread even further. TV anchors debated ethics and oversight. Talking heads argued about animal rights, government secrecy, and the moral cost of war. Some networks demanded to see Ranger, offered money for exclusive interviews, or tried to get footage of the cabin. Drones buzzed overhead. At night, the distant glow of headlights on the snow made Miriam's skin crawl. Through it all, the core remained. Ranger, Cassie, Mrs. Rowland, Tyler, and Miriam together in the cabin. They shielded each other as best they could. They watched the news together, crying and laughing in turns. Sometimes Cassie would sit quietly with Ranger, just holding him as if anchoring him to the real world amid the chaos. When the request came for Miriam to testify, first via phone, then a formal letter, she was terrified. The thought of standing before a panel, of reliving everything, was almost too much. "I don't think I can do this," she admitted one night, voice breaking. Cassie took her hand, small and warm. "You're brave, Dr. Hayes. Like Ranger, you always tell the truth." It was enough. Miriam agreed to testify. The world would hear not only about Ranger and the chip, but about everything that came after, the break-in, the threats, the fight for one traumatized dog's life. As the night deepened and the world's eyes turned to their mountain refuge, Miriam realized the fight wasn't just for Ranger anymore. It was for Cassie. For every animal and every person who'd been silenced by fear. For herself. They were not alone. Not anymore. And that, for the first time, was enough to make Miriam believe in something like hope again. The day of Miriam's testimony dawned gray and cold, the mountain sky as heavy as Miriam's nerves. A late snowstorm threatened to close the pass down to Denver, but nothing, weather, nerves, or the unmarked cars that still sometimes lingered at the edges of the forest, was going to stop her. She owed Ranger that much. She owed herself and Cassie and every voiceless animal who'd never had a champion. Tyler drove, his hands steady on the wheel, even as the highway vanished into blowing drifts. Cassie rode between Miriam and Mrs. Rowland in the back seat, clutching Ranger's new harness. For the first time since the whole nightmare began, Ranger would leave the mountains, accompanying Miriam, officially, as her dog. Cassie insisted on coming too, her face pale but determined. "He needs his family," she said, and Miriam couldn't argue. Security was tight at the courthouse, reporters pressed against barricades, cameras flashing as soon as the battered Subaru appeared. Miriam kept her head down, shoulders hunched, but Cassie stood tall, Ranger at her side. The dog was calm in the chaos, moving with a gentle alertness that made the crowd part like water around him. For all the anxiety churning inside, Miriam felt a sliver of pride. Ranger was no longer the empty shell they'd found in the snow. He was, finally, himself. Inside, the panel was waiting. Senators, government officials, activists, military consultants. even a few former handlers. The hearing room was packed, air thick with anticipation. Riley Kane sat near the front, notebook in hand, and nodded as Miriam entered. Tyler squeezed her shoulder before taking his seat with Cassie and Mrs. Rowland. When Miriam's name was called, her heart hammered so hard she was sure the microphone would pick it up. She steadied herself, met Cassie's gaze, full of trust and encouragement, and began. At first, her voice shook. She described the night Tyler found Ranger, the silent animal on the verge of death. She explained the operation, the discovery of the chip, the initial fear and confusion. Her hands trembled as she recounted the break-in at the clinic and the chilling note left behind. Faces in the crowd shifted, some hardened with anger, others with disbelief, a few with tears. But as Miriam spoke, something changed. She looked at Ranger, lying at Cassie's feet, eyes fixed on her, and she felt a surge of courage she hadn't known she still possessed. She went deeper, talked about the darkness she'd lived in after Andrew's death, the way healing had seemed impossible until Ranger, Cassie, and the mountains forced her heart open again. She didn't just talk about trauma. She talked about hope, about the slow work of trust and recovery, about the choice to love and to fight, even when every instinct screamed to hide. "You asked me to talk about what happened to Ranger," Miriam said, voice growing stronger. "But this isn't just his story. It's the story of what happens when we treat life, any life, as disposable. It's about the cost of secrecy, the damage done by power unchecked. Ranger survived not because of technology, but because people, strangers, a child, a community, chose compassion over fear." Senators asked hard questions, some doubted her story, pressed for technical details, demanded to see the chip, now in government custody as evidence. Miriam answered each question calmly, refusing to be rattled. She spoke about Lena's findings, the classified records, the parade of unmarked vehicles outside her clinic, and the cabin. She described the terror of feeling hunted, the courage it took just to keep going. A few panel members tried to steer the conversation back to national security, to whether dogs like Ranger should ever be allowed in public hands. That was when Cassie, unable to stay silent, rose to speak. Her voice was small but clear. "Ranger helped me not be afraid. He was hurt and scared, but he learned to trust again because people believed in him. And he helped me talk to people, even up here, today." A hush fell over the room. Mrs. Rowland dabbed at her eyes. Tyler nodded in silent support. Even a few of the hardened officials looked away, uncomfortable. In the days that followed, Miriam and Cassie's testimony was played on news loops across the country. People sent letters and emails, hundreds, then thousands, thanking them for their courage, sharing their own stories of rescue and recovery. A retired soldier from Virginia wrote, "If only more people had spoken out years ago, maybe my K9 would still be alive." An animal shelter in Oregon launched a Ranger Fund for dogs with special needs. The hashtag #FreePaws trended for weeks. With the story in the open and pressure mounting from both the public and whistleblowers, the government made a rare, if carefully worded, admission. Project Threshold had existed. It was deeply regretted, no longer in operation, and all surviving dogs were accounted for or placed in loving homes. Miriam and her friends knew the last part was a stretch, but at least the lies had cracked. At home in the cabin, the impact of their testimony rippled outward. Miriam received an official letter. Ranger was now hers, fully and finally adopted, free from any claim or threat of confiscation. Cassie, glowing with pride, made a collar tag that read, "Ranger, beloved." With Riley Kane's help, Miriam and Tyler began the first steps of launching FreePaws, a nonprofit dedicated to rescuing working dogs in crisis and pairing them with at-risk youth. Cassie was their very first junior volunteer, tasked with writing the group's motto, "Second chances for every soul." The healing continued, not as a single event, but as a daily choice. Miriam still had nightmares, but now she woke to the sound of Ranger's paws in the hall and Cassie's gentle singing in the kitchen. Tyler visited every weekend. Mrs. Rowland taught Cassie how to knit, and Miriam how to make bread that didn't burn. Through it all, Ranger thrived, curious, watchful, loyal. Sometimes, in the hush before dawn, Cassie would whisper to him about her dreams, and Ranger would press close, a living reminder that survival was only the beginning. Trust and love, rebuilt day by day, were what made the journey home complete. Their fight was far from over, but it was no longer just their fight. Across the country, people were listening, asking questions, demanding change. And in a mountain cabin, surrounded by snow and hope, Miriam, Cassie, Ranger, and the rest of their unlikely family dared to believe that the future, at last, belonged to them. 1 year had passed since that endless winter night, the night a broken German shepherd came in from the snow, and a grieving veterinarian let the world into her pain. The world had changed for all of them in ways they couldn't have imagined. But as summer returned to the Rockies, painting the mountains with wildflowers and sunlight, the cabin at Netherland felt at last like a place of belonging, not exile. Miriam sat on the porch, a mug of coffee warming her hands, the blue sky bright above the pines. The scent of pine sap and bread baking drifted through the open window. Ranger lay sprawled beside her, his head pillowed on Cassie's lap, eyes half closed in contentment, but ears alert for every sound. A bluebird's call, a squirrel's chatter, the laughter of friends. Cassie's fingers toyed with the fur around his collar, now bright with the custom tag she'd made. Ranger, beloved. The world outside the mountains seemed both closer and farther away. News still came in. Emails from volunteers at Free Paws, updates from Riley Kane about new investigations, invitations to speak at conferences or community events. But for the first time in a long while, Miriam no longer felt pulled in a dozen anxious directions. Instead, her days revolved around what mattered: family, healing, and the slow, sometimes messy work of building a life from what had once seemed beyond repair. On the porch, Cassie held a thin, printed book in her hands, its cover illustrated with a childlike drawing of a dog and a little girl standing beneath pine trees. The title read, "The Dog Who Came Back." It was the story Miriam and Cassie had written together, Cassie's words and imagination woven with Miriam's memories and careful hope. Published with the help of Free Paws, it was now in the hands of hundreds of children in shelters and foster homes across the country. Sometimes, the letters they received from readers would bring Miriam to tears. A child in Tulsa writing, "I believe I can heal too," or a girl in Boston drawing her own version of Ranger and Cassie, hope shining in every crayon stroke. That morning, Cassie snuggled closer to Ranger and read the story aloud, her voice steady and clear. Once there was a dog who lost everything. He wandered alone until he found a place where people saw him, not as a machine, not as a project, but as a friend. Together, they learned to heal, and together, they found their way home. When she finished, she closed the book with a soft sigh, tracing the cover. "Do you think he remembers?" she asked quietly, not quite looking at Miriam. Miriam considered the question, watching the way Ranger's tail thumped, slow and content, against the old porch wood. The question wasn't just about memory, it was about everything they had lost and found. "Maybe," she said, her voice gentle, "but I think he remembers us more. The love, the laughter, the new things we do together. That's what matters." Cassie smiled, satisfied, and pressed her cheek to Ranger's head. "He's my best friend," she whispered. The porch was a gathering place now, Tyler arriving with groceries and jokes, Mrs. Rowland knitting or humming as she watered the pots of flowers. On weekends, children and families from the valley visited, bringing their own dogs or just their stories. Ranger greeted them all, cautious with new people, patient with nervous children, a steady, reassuring presence. Free Paws had grown beyond anything Miriam imagined. The nonprofit worked with veterans groups, youth centers, animal shelters. Their first year saw over 20 dogs, rescued from troubled backgrounds, shelters, even other secretive programs, placed with families and young people who needed them. Each adoption was a celebration. Each letter from a new friend felt like another thread in a widening web of hope. Sometimes the past threatened to intrude. A strange car on the road, a cold call from a government official, another whistleblower reaching out. But these moments no longer filled Miriam with dread. She'd learned to trust her instincts, to surround herself with friends, to keep records, and always, always tell the truth. In quiet moments, Miriam would remember the darkness that once seemed bottomless, the grief for Andrew, the fear and loneliness, the hopelessness she'd felt that bitter winter. Now, she honored those memories as part of her story, but not the end. She thought often about what Andrew would say if he could see her, see the family she'd built, the difference she was making. In her heart, she felt his approval, a warm ember that never quite went out. Cassie thrived at school, her shyness softened by confidence. She became a leader in her class, known for her gentle way with animals and people alike. Her teachers sometimes sent notes. Cassie helps other students open up. She's the first to notice when someone feels left out. When she was invited to present about Free Paws at her school, she brought Ranger along. The two stood before a sea of eager faces as Cassie told their story, how one brave dog and a group of people who refused to give up changed everything. Tyler and Mrs. Rowland became constants in Miriam's life. Tyler's quiet support and humor steadied her, while Mrs. Rowland's old wisdom and kindness filled the cabin with a sense of generational strength. On some evenings, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, the four of them would sit on the porch, sharing stories or just watching the stars. Ranger's transformation was a beacon. Gone was the haunted animal from the snow, the victim of cold experiments and colder hearts. Now, he was a dog who lived in the present, watchful, loyal, sometimes playful, sometimes wise. He slept at Cassie's feet every night, patrolled the property with Tyler, and seemed to know just when someone needed comfort. His presence healed more than wounds. It mended the invisible cracks left by trauma and loss. As the sun set on the cabin, painting the porch gold, Miriam felt a peace she'd once thought impossible. The world was not perfect. There were still battles to fight, stories to tell, dogs and children in need of rescue, but she'd learned the strength of second chances, the power of community, and the quiet miracles that grew when hope was shared. The last light lingered on the porch, illuminating the small family gathered there. Cassie read aloud from their book, Mrs. Rowland smiled, Tyler laughed at something only Ranger seemed to understand, and Miriam simply sat back, letting the sounds of life fill her up. Once there was a dog who came back, Cassie read softly, and so did we. The camera of the world, if anyone was still watching, might have lingered on Ranger's eyes, full now, not of fear or emptiness, but of love, trust, and a peace earned together. And so, on a porch in the Colorado mountains, a dog and his family watched another day end, no longer haunted by the past, but dreaming, finally, of the future. Underscore, 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 underscore.